This is partially a continuation from my last video regarding Palestine, which was titled Freedom. But this will be a bit broader than just the Palestinian issue, but will include the various other issues that are raised with the two-state solutions that have been practiced and implemented across the world. As you can understand from my last video, I am not particularly favorable, to say the least, to the two-state solution in regards to Palestine. However, for the sake of consistency, it is worth noting that the two-state solution is fundamentally flawed, and the fundamental flaws and problems with the two-state solution have led to a lot of these conflicts around the world, whether it be with the Ulster province in Ireland, or with the case of India and Pakistan, and even now with countries like Bangladesh or Sri Lanka. The fundamental problem and the fundamental flaw with two-state solutions is that it simply amplifies and further exaggerates and reinforces and fundamentally solidifies these ethno-religious conflicts. The way that I would describe it is as the Ulster-nation relationship or the Ulster-nation binary. This is of course borrowing from the terminology of the Ulster province in Ireland. This is whereby the Ulster exists in contradistinction or even so in contradiction to the claims of the nation, whereby the nation is, for lack of a better framing, a kind of organic unit. The Ulster is an ethno-religious province, or in certain cases even a settler colonial project. In fact, there is a fundamental reason as to why the Irish are so sympathetic to the Palestinians, despite, being a white European peoples and not necessarily being very similar to the Arab, mostly Muslim, but also Christian Palestinians. That is because they share some very common experiences, and there are a lot of similarities between the experiences of the Irish with the Ulster province and the settler colonial regime in Palestine.
The Irish people understand the Palestinian anti-colonial struggle in a way that the so-called great European nations, France, Germany, Britain, can never understand. These countries have traditionally been the oppressor and not the oppressed. Ireland, like Palestine, knows what it's like to be brutalised and to have our land confiscated and gifted to settlers who deem themselves to be ethnically superior to us. During Oliver Cromwell's genocidal campaign in Ireland, his slogan for the native Catholic population was that they could go to hell or to Connacht, i.e. to poor land in the west of the country, a likely early prototype for Native American reservations. Like Palestine, we never stopped resisting our oppression, which led us to being labelled terrorists by the oppressor. A Palestinian friend recently told me that when Palestinians refuse food in Israeli jails and accept only water and salt, they call it going on an Irish hunger strike. The recent racist and orientalist cartoon in the Washington Post depicting Palestinians as base and amoral called to mind the similarly dehumanising British Punch magazine depictions of Irish as simian and lawless. During Ireland's War of Independence, which led to the partial liberation of the country from the British Empire, the IRA fought a particularly reviled class of British soldier known as the Black and Tans, who were infamous for their brutality against the civilian population. Well, after the war, some of these fine gentlemen were exported to Palestine. In fact, Britain's partition of Ireland and the creation of the British Unionist supremacist statelet of Northern Ireland became a kind of prototype for the Zionist project, with Britain declaring its intentions to create a little loyal Jewish Ulster in a sea of potentially hostile Arabism. In more recent times, my friends in the north of Ireland have experienced something at the hands of the colonial oppressor that Palestinians know only too well. That is the denial of justice. Britain's recent shameful legacy bill effectively grants amnesty to British soldiers who carried out war crimes during the Troubles. These are some of the reasons why many of us have your back. Oh, and because it's the right thing to do. There's nothing complicated about genocide.
This also does extend to the case of Pakistan and India. Now, of course, I am a Pakistani insofar as my parents are from Pakistan and I have visited the country. And of course, that is a bit more personal for me, but on a very objective level, the reality is that the partition has failed in preventing ethno-religious conflict between Hindus and Muslims in India. And in reality, it has simply amplified and reinforced that conflict in many cases. Of course, a lot of this ties back into the history of the various independence movements that were taking place during the decolonialization period or during the period where British power was waning away in India. The Congress movement, of course, the kind of secular nationalists, which very much was a kind of composite nationalism comprising of both Muslims and Hindus and even others, focused on a kind of secular Indian nationalism which embraced a lot of the diversity of the Indian subcontinent. Of course, for those who argued for the two-state solution and argued for the creation of an independent Muslim state like Jinnah and Iqbal and others, they of course believed that, well, Indian Muslims were always going to have to prove that they were indeed Indians. And so that's why that was the fundamental logic that led to the creation of another state. However, there are some pretty obvious flaws with that logic, but most of all, it's the fact that by creating this Ulster, it didn't in fact downplay or get rid of that fundamental issue of Muslims having to prove that they are Indians, but rather by creating this Ulster explicitly along those ethno-religious lines, or even more specifically along those religious lines, it just reinforced that sentiment. It reinforced that fact that Muslims were going to have to prove that they are Indians. Indeed, today you see on both sides of the border, whether it be the persecution of certain religious minorities in Pakistan, or the way that, certain groups like certain Muslims, certain Christians are persecuted in India, you see that in fact that has simply reinforced that ethno-religious conflict. It has simply created the conditions for even more of that to occur, and it has in fact amplified it and cemented it as a fundamental part of the politics of the region. Think about it. If India was still united, Muslims and Hindus would have had sufficient populations, sufficient voting blocks to prevent any extremist parties or any ultra-nationalist parties from coming into power. Muslims would be about 600 to 700 million, and they could have maintained their own distinct Islamic identity within the Indian context itself. Again, the fundamental nationalist argument in the Indian context was about embracing that diversity that naturally was a part of the Indian story. And so Muslims could have maintained that, whilst also maintaining this kind of united India that incorporated all of these different groups and represented all of their interests.
It's been 70 years,
Yeah.
and let's resolve the issues and let's talk about Kashmir. And how long will we keep on talking about Kashmir and keep this as the bone of contention?
I'm not, you are. but the point is,
But with your profound experience with the United Nations, I see you somewhere,
yeah, no, but just to answer that, I mean, the thing is that what Pakistanis often fail to appreciate is that there is a big difference in the logic underlying partition from two different sides of the border. Pakistan is created as a result of one party wanting a state for people of a particular religion. Now, the Indian nationalist movement never bought into that logic. It always claimed to be a movement of every faith, every religion, every caste, every language, every color, and so on.
Thus, of course, the Muslim population and the Hindu population would act as a balance or a check on the power of the other. And any of the other minorities, whether they be Christians, Jains, Sikhs, or any other ethnic minorities, they could side with each respective group depending upon their own interests, and thus it would have created the conditions for a more representative democracy, but also, like I said, it would prevent any other extremist or ultra-nationalist parties from coming into power. This also is a source for the confusion over Pakistan's identity. Is Pakistan a secular country with a Muslim majority, or is it a fundamentally Islamic country? This is, of course, summarized in the oxymoron of Islamic Republic of Pakistan, because of course republic denotes something which is secular, but the term Islamic denotes something which is religious. And this, of course, has affected a lot of the politics since the very inception of Pakistan. In reality, many of the elites who were part of the kind of anti-colonial independence movements were very much part of this kind of westernized, Western-educated elite. For example, Gandhi was part of this westernized elite. He was a lawyer before he adopted this more Hindu, kind of openly Hindu approach. And Jinnah was very much a secular Muslim. You know, he did things like drink wine, eat pork, and his outlook was very much a secular one. Yes, he wanted a Muslim state, but he fundamentally conceived of it as a secular state with a Muslim identity. Of course, this was one of the great ironies of history, that many of those leading various anti-colonialist movements across the world were westernized elites borrowing from the legacy, the intellectual legacy of the imperialists for their own ends, as Yuval Noah Harari points out in his book Sapiens, for example. In truth, anti-colonialists, or people who try to form their own native identities, in many cases have to borrow from the legacy of various imperialist or foreign interventionist powers. And this is true of Western colonialism just as it is true of the earlier Islamic or Arab imperialism, of Persians, of Turks, of the Chinese, of the Russians or the Slavs, etc., etc., of all of them very much. Of course, the elites, whilst being quite secular, the populace or most of the population tend to be quite religious or at least quite conservative, and this is also a source of a lot of conflict. We see on both sides of the border, whether it be with mistreatment of certain religious or ethnic minorities, Balochis or Bengalis or Kashmiris or Maypuris, whether it be with the funding of extremist or terrorist or ultra-nationalist political groups or militant factions, or whether it be with fundamentalism or ultra-nationalism. And so, in any case, a lot of these fundamental issues have been reinforced and amplified by the two-state settlement. In truth, I think it's fundamental to understand that for Muslims in India, they have this distinctive Indo-Islamic identity. Of course, for many of us, you know, our faith comes first, there's no doubt about it. But again, because Islam is a universal faith, it can incorporate and facilitate these various cultural and ethnic identities under its banner. And in truth, Muslim culture in India has various influences, whether it be the Hindu or Buddhist influences, the Arab, Persian, Turkish, or even Western influences. So we should embrace that identity. We shouldn't be arrogant or discriminatory on that basis, and we can retain that identity whilst not viewing ourselves as different or better than other Indian peoples of different tribes or different faiths. And only by accepting the inherent diversity of the Indian peoples and of the Indian story and moving together with that and accepting that, rather than viewing Indian or Pakistani or Muslim or Hindu identity purely on exclusionary lines, can Hindus and Muslims of an Indian background begin to move together towards a more peaceful and harmonious society. Of course, we can talk about the history of India, for example, under the Mughals. But even under the Mughals, there wasn't an idea of a distinct nation separate from India. It was an Indian empire under the rule of Muslims. And of course, with the Mughals comes the concept or the debate regarding Muslim or Islamic imperialism. And in truth, of course, this was done by Persians and Turks, right? This was a Persian-Turkish dynasty, so to speak. Of course, earlier with the Arab invasions, they conquered Sind initially, but of course these later Muslim empires came from people of Persian and Turkish stock. And we do have to be honest about our history whilst accounting for historical nuance. As Dr. Yasir Qadhi has famously said, that our religion is divine, but our history is very much human. And just like the history of all other peoples, indeed the history of mankind as a whole, Muslim history or Islamic history is filled with the good, the bad, and the ugly. And just like with Western colonialists, they did many good and bad things. Unfortunately, there were atrocities committed against Hindus and even later on against Sikhs. In many cases, they were relatively tolerant of the indigenous populations and their faiths. And for example, there were expressions of this kind of, religious Unitarianism, so to speak, And under emperors such as Akbar, you had the ideas of Sulh-e-Kul, peace for all, and Deen-e-Ilahi, the divine religion, which embraced all of these different religions very much. For example, during the time of Akbar, there was the translation of Hindu epics into Persian. Unfortunately, later on with the likes of Aurangzeb, Sultan Aurangzeb, etc., there was persecution of certain religious minorities, although many of these were more so political than religiously motivated. And like I mentioned, the Arab invasions began earlier. However, many of the later Islamic acts of imperialism or invasion were under the banner of Persians and Turks. Hence, you can't just single out and blame the Arabs for this. And ironically, a lot of the secular Persian and Turkish nationalists who are against Arab conquest and Arab imperialism, okay, fair enough, that's a fair point in and of itself. But then what they don't seem to understand, or what they seem to overlook rather on a historical basis, is that Persians and Turks were just as involved, in fact in later centuries were more so involved, and the primary flag bearers of Islamic conquests and Islamic empires and Islamic imperialism than the Arabs were. You know, like I have mentioned in the past, in reality, pretty much every single group of peoples has engaged in imperialism, in conquest, in atrocities at one point or another, whether it be Westerners or Europeans or Christians, whether it be Jewish, Semitic peoples, whether it be Arabs, Persians or Turks, under the banner of Islam, or indeed even before Islam, under various other banners. Whether it be the Mongols, whether it be the Chinese, whether it be the Russians, one can address all of these, one can address the imperialism of all of them and call out their evils and evil doings all at the same time. That can all be true at the same time. History informs us that all groups are culpable or liable for having blood on their hands at one point or another and has some share of guilt and blame. This doesn't mean that we don't acknowledge the good things that they did. Indeed, all of these civilizations have contributed significantly to humanity, but we can absolutely call out their evil as well. It is important at the end of the day, the most important point being that we be historically honest about their history.